Today I wanted to talk about sustainability and if we have a sustainable society and if it's even possible to get a sustainable society. So I'm starting with a comic from one of my favorite online comics, XKCD, and it's about whether the use of the word sustainable is sustainable, because nobody talked about sustainability. The people before the 50s, these are people that lived through world wars and Great Depressions. They weren't consumers. They were very careful with things. They only bought things that they really needed, and they reused things very well and kept things careful. They were frugal. They weren't consumers. It was a new idea that was sort of pushed on the American economy in the 50s. And as we started to push consumer economy and we started to develop products that were throwawayable, things didn't used to be made to be thrown away. It wasn't until we developed cheap plastics that made it possible to just throw things away. When you were making things out of more expensive woods and metals and fibers, you made things to last. So it's a very different kind of economy, and a lot of people hope that maybe we can get back to that kind of economy. We frequently define ourselves as what we consume, through what we consume. This is a quote from one of the textbooks that I'm not using this year, but people define themselves through what they consume. How you outwardly project your appearance is through what you consume. So if we were in a classroom, I would have a discussion or try to have a discussion with you guys about whether you agreed with this statement or not. I'm going to go through and try to give you some arguments on both sides and help you form that opinion. So we might have a clicker question to sort of start the discussion. I like to start with the idea of punk, because when I was a kid in the 80s, punk was kind of a new idea. Punks were rebellious. And now in my late 30s, the idea of rebellious is very different than what the idea was of rebellious as a 12-year-old or 15-year-old. So, but I still, when I think of punk, think of these pictures of people from the 80s of what was punk at that time. And these people are very much about how they outwardly projected what they bought, what they listened to. That's how they showed that they were rebellious. They bought leather and they bought hair gel and they listened to and so purchased different kinds of music. It's about what they're consuming as much as what they believe. So this is another great one that has sort of, for me, changed over the years. So middle class. When I was a kid, this was middle class. You know, white picket fence, 2.3 kids, house in the suburbs. And that's kind of changed over the years, where middle class used to mean one thing, where there was like a nice Welcome to Beaver family, and then it was more like Malcolm in the Middle, sort of less put together family all piled into a minivan. And now we have like a whole generation of millennials who may or may not have family and probably don't own a house and or maybe a car. And they're still middle class. It's sort of shifted as I've grown older, but it's all about how much money we make, what we consume. I love this one because environmentalists, again, have changed throughout the years. And these are three pictures. These were the top three pictures from a Google search that I did a couple of years ago. And I just love them. So there's a picture of some guy hiking, taking a picture of moss. There's a picture of a lady in a loose-fitting shirt holding a CFL light bulb. And then there's this. I'm not quite sure exactly what this is, but I think this holds back to the time when almost all environmentalists were hippies. When the environmentalist movement started in like a little bit in the 50s, but mostly it was the 60s. It wasn't the 70s until like environmentalism really came forward. And it was hippies, it was fringe people that were environmentalists. It wasn't upstanding citizens typically. I think we still have this kind of hippie kind of ideal when we talk about environmentalists. So how did we get to this consumer society? If my grandparents were quite frugal, they weren't typically consumerists. They saved everything. They never threw anything out, like anything. They always reused everything. They were hippie, they were environmentalists without even knowing they're environmentalists. This consumer society happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s, this throwaway culture. We were sort of gradually convinced to get there. It wasn't a very quick switch. But kids growing up with these quick and easy disposable items, that's what they're used to. Again, in textbooks that I'm not using this year, there are case studies about how some of these industries slowly got us on board. So classic is the car industry. When cars first came to North America, they were banned from city streets. People didn't want them. They were noisy and loud and fast and dangerous. Pedestrians ruled the road. Horses ruled the road. Cars, they were worried about cars scaring horses. You used to have to pull over and stop and turn off your automobile so the horses didn't get spooked. And it took car companies a lot of wheeling and dealing to make laws and convince people that cars were in charge of the road and that was not a safe place for pedestrians. And we've totally changed our entire continent to accommodate cars. So that's a great look at how an industry has changed our way we consume. Because if we had put the amount of money and effort into, say, trains over cars, we might not live in a society where everyone needed to own a car in order to survive in that society. Fast food's a great one too. When fast food restaurants first existed, people didn't want to go to them. When you went out to the restaurant, you expected good service and good food. It was an experience to go out. It wasn't cheap food. So it took fast food companies a long time and a lot of marketing to get people on board to that. And fast food industry is really bad for disposable garbage in general. Restaurant industries are not great in terms of recycling and garbage, but fast food more than most. The pet industry is an amazing one once you start looking at it, because you don't really realize it because we love our pets. But 100 years ago, pets were not family members. Even 50 years ago, pets were rarely family members. Pets had a role in your house. They were there, they had a job. And you didn't buy them special food, they ate your leftovers. And you might buy them some cheap kibble, but you weren't buying them expensive food. You definitely weren't buying them crazy toys and jackets. There's an entire market of toys and clothing for pets that did not exist, that we've been sort of convinced into purchasing these sorts of things. It's a really interesting progression of seeing how the way we treat pets and what we do for our pets has changed a lot. This brings us to the argument of, did we have a choice? Do we need to change? Will consumerism ultimately just decline on its own, whether we do something about it or not? Should we be trying to make it decline sooner, or should we wait for some catastrophe in the economy to collapse before we stop consuming? Will it happen on its own? Do we need to force it to change? Do we need governments to force it to change? It's a really interesting debate, if we had a class to do a debate about whether we should be actively fighting this or whether we should just decrease what we're doing and let it happen. So zero waste living has become quite a thing in recent years. When I first started teaching this course, zero waste living, the phrase, did not exist. There were people who were trying to be eco-friendly, but we weren't trying to live zero waste. But part of being sustainable, part of not having all this waste, is learning simpler tasks, learning how to do these skills without having to purchase throwaway items. So a big one right now is preserving foods. Canning your own foods has never been more popular, not since my grandmother's time. So this is great. And there are a lot of people with these skills. We're lucky to have a lot of Indigenous peoples that have knowledge of how to live sustainably off the land. But sometimes we don't have to go that far. We don't have to listen to professors speak. We don't have to find elders to talk to, because your own grandparents might have these skills. Your next door neighbor might have these skills. Start looking to the people around you, and it's amazing who you know that have some of these skills and just haven't had to use them in years. You might know someone who has an amazing salt pickle recipe, or someone that used to be a trapper or knows how to spin wool. Who knows? Once you start asking around, it's amazing the skills that people have if you take a moment to learn. People are always willing to teach. So that's what Transition Town is about. Transition Town is about finding people. So the idea behind Transition Town is transitioning a town into a sustainable community. So most transition towns have a lot of community initiatives that support green activities, but they're about creating connections. When you go to a transition town, you're learning who else in your community is interested in this and has skills to learn and teach. So you might know how to make amazing pickles, but you're not a really good farmer, and you go to transition town, you find someone who's growing a ton of vegetables that need pickling but doesn't know how to pickle, and you guys can help each other out. Or there's all sorts of different skill sets. There is a transition town, North Bay. I haven't been in a while, sadly, but they used to do potluck meetings, which were amazing. You don't have to go to the potluck. The meeting used to start at 6, but if you want to do the potluck, you go at 5:30. But it was like, these are transition town people. The food was always really interesting local food. So I always loved doing the potluck if I was going to go. They used to meet at St. Andrew's Church downtown North Bay on Thursdays, but you should check out the website and see if you're interested in being part of that community. So part of transitioning and being eco-friendly is starting to think about, can we all be sustainable? I have learned a lot over the years from my elders, from Indigenous elders in this community. We're really lucky in North Bay to have several Indigenous communities with elders who are willing to share. And it's nice to learn these skills to live off the land. And in Canada, it's pretty doable. I have friends who last year spent the entire year eating only food that they foraged themselves. But is that sustainable for everyone? What if everyone from Toronto started to live off the land, came up here? Could everyone do that? And this is one of the things that I bring up regularly with my hunting friends who talk about deer being more sustainable than cows, and not at the rate that we eat cows. There's a reason why we have cattle, because if everyone ate wild deer at the rate that we eat cattle, we would have no more wild deer. So while it is a sustainable food source for the few privileged of us here, it's not a sustainable food source for everyone. Which brings up that situation of how much land do we need? What eating habits should we have? So if we were to live on one planet, because currently most North Americans require more than one planet to live in the way that we live. So these are numbers that I did rounding math a couple years ago. I haven't updated them this year because there's too much to do this year. We have 11.9 billion hectares of useful land on Earth, give or take. So that's not including deserts, that's not including mountains or glaciers, right? Usable land that you could actually farm and live on. Approximately 7 billion people at the time that I did this math leaves 1.7 hectares per person. But just people. I'm not, in this math, I'm not including all the wild animals and plants. If I split up all the usable land, each person would get 1.7 hectares. I don't know how to do that math and include plants and animals. So to give you an idea, here is what 1.7 hectares looks like. It's basically the pond on campus. Or we could look at it as half a city block in downtown North Bay. Could you live on that? Could you survive on 1.7 hectares all by yourself? Maybe combine, you and your partner could combine your properties. It's a tough one. And I've thought about this a lot. And I could do it, but I wouldn't want to. Like, it would be hard. I could definitely farm all the food I needed to eat. And I'd have to learn a little bit more about butchering because I would want to have some chickens, a pig, a cow, so they could have some dairy, so I could have fat, animal fat for making soap. But there's a lot of things that I couldn't do on 1.7 hectares. So say I had some sheep and I sheared the sheep. In theory, I know how to shear a sheep, clean the wool, spin it, and make clothes. I can knit. I wouldn't want to wear those clothes. So where am I going to get better clothing? And that's not including like things like sugar. Maybe I could have some maple trees on my property and get some maple sugar, but I would miss sugar. But more importantly, glass. I don't know if I could make glass and then have jars. Like if I got all these vegetables, I'm going to want to can them. What am I going to can them in if I don't have glass? I could make soap if I had animals to get the animal fat. I could make soap. But toilet paper, that would be nice to have. I don't know. I guess maybe I could make some cloth things. I need a lot of water. How much water do I get on that 1.78 hectares? But that's not including things like coffee and tea, or avocados and bananas and oranges. Most of my fruit in North Bay, I might have apples, cherries, berries. It really limits what you have, what you can, where you are in the world, where your 1.7 hectares are. And once we start trading and bartering, then we're back to our global economy pretty fast. If we wanted to only have the resources that are around us in this one planet living, what changes would you have to make? In that 1.7 hectares, I never even considered the materials to make a car, or the gas to drive places, or the fuel to heat my house, or the materials to make my house. Not that I'd need a car anyway if I'm in my 1.7 hectares, but it's really hard for us to think about what changes we're going to make in society. This is a video, so the link was on the last page. This video is by Hank Green. You might have seen him. He's in a lot of places on YouTube. And it's about understanding that the world is a big place and sustainability is a global problem. And that, yes, we need to change our own personal habits, but we also need to work on changing the laws of our country. And we need to think about what solutions are going to help everyone. Because we can't just make solutions for one country or one province or one city. We need to start thinking globally because we are one global planet. It's a really good video. The next slide is going to play automatically, but I might skip it rather than, like, usually I'm in a classroom and we sit and we watch it together. But rather than me putting on YouTube a video where there's a YouTube clip, you guys can just watch it on your own time. Hank's discussion brings me to an eco footprint. He mentions that not everyone can live like North Americans live, that we need several planets. So I don't know if you guys have ever done your eco footprint or carbon footprint. There's lots of websites out there. It's very eye-opening sometimes to go through them and see how many planets you would take if everyone on Earth consumed like you consumed. Rarely do I ever make it down to one planet. Usually it takes more than one planet for me to live my lifestyle if everyone lived my lifestyle. And I try really hard to be more environmentally friendly than your average Canadian. I'm obviously not perfect. There's tons of things that I'm doing wrong, and everybody has to realize that no one can do everything perfectly, but we're still on average really bad, and we need to get better. One of the things is we need to be less dependent on fossil fuels. Why are we so dependent on fossil fuels? But yeah, go calculate your eco footprint online. Maybe we can have a discussion about it later because it's a fun task and there's lots of different calculators there. One person who took this totally literally, the one planet living, the zero waste lifestyle, again, when No Impact Man started, there wasn't a zero waste Instagram trend. This was pre-Instagram. He had a blog that he wrote and was filming the experience. So when I followed his blog as he went through the year, he spent a year trying to become No Impact Man. And after the year finished, there was a gap, and then a movie came out of that experience, which is very entertaining. I think the YouTube link at the bottom of this page is to a preview, not the actual film, but it is out there online. You can watch the whole thing. It's very cool to see the solutions that they come up with and the ones that don't work, and his wife is not quite on board the same way he is, so that's always entertaining, them trying to figure out that and stay married. But he comes pretty close to No Impact. He lives in New York, so they still have water. They never turn their water off, but they turn off their electricity. They walk up and down the stairs rather than use the elevator. They don't have to have a vehicle because they live in downtown New York City. So that's always something. It's a lot harder for someone in rural Canada to go completely no impact than someone in a big city when it comes to things like driving a car and heating your house. When you're living off of a grid, it's a little bit different. So he was able to buy in New York City a lot of local markets that are affordable, where he could go and talk to people and get them to give him food without packaging and get things from the farms just outside of New York City. So that was pretty cool, like the different conveniences that are different there that I hadn't considered living where I live. But this is, I also wanted to talk about this one quote from his blog about laundry, because they got rid of all of their appliances, and he said that the one appliance that he missed the most was the washing machine for laundry, because the amount of time it takes in your day to wash laundry by hand, to agitate it, to break up all the dirt particles, to rinse it, to wring it out, to hang it, that it's a huge time suck, and a laundry machine makes all the difference. And he wishes everyone in the world could have one. So anyway, it's a really good video. I recommend watching. It definitely helped me become better at my slow progression of zero waste. Here's another video for you guys to watch. This is the story of change. So in first year, we watched the story of stuff, which goes through the progression of how North Americans got to be consumers and how we just buy too much stuff. And all of us need to just buy less stuff. And this is the story of change. So this talks about how we can change that. What are the steps to take and how everyone has different roles. We can make something new, and it doesn't have to be, not everyone can go zero waste, but there are other things. Some people can be teachers and some people can be lawyers, and everyone needs to work together. And this is the video. It's going to play, but I'm going to probably skip over it. You guys can watch it on your own time. So the story of change discusses how part of that process is having people who can lobby the government and write new laws and make new policies, because only about 3% of the waste comes from households. Most waste in a garbage dump or a landfill is from industry. That industry is usually making things for our households, but they're making a lot of garbage and waste in the process and pollution in the process to make that stuff for us. So we should reduce our input because that will reduce the industry, but by making policies and laws that affect those corporations, we make a bigger impact. So the story of stuff makes the argument about, should we recycle? Of course we should recycle, but that's not enough. We need to change those policies. So I love this Alice Walker quote: "The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any." We have the power to change. This is that age-old argument about going to vote, even if you think it's hopeless, right? To stand up and make a difference. You can do this. We can all change these policies. We just have to do it. So sometimes you help by joining organizations, gathering signatures. Other people can write articles. Other people teach future lawyers and writers and politicians. Invite people, educate people, spread the word, organize protests, be in protests. There's lots of different things you can do to help change policies. The simplest one is to buy from companies that you agree with and to write letters to politicians, like physical letters. If you're not happy with a politician, write to them. Write to that politician and tell them what you need. Physical letters make a big difference. And if enough people do it, they'll change because they want your vote. The next thing I wanted to talk about was deep ecology. So this is the idea of trying to change our economy from egocentric to ecocentric. So can we find a way to make our economy ecology centered? Can we figure out a way to have environmentalism be a full philosophy of our society? And this is a tough one. Granting nature human rights has been an interesting way of moving forward on this. So here are a couple of articles of actual pieces of nature that got the legal rights of a person. So I think the first one is of a river, and the second one is of a tree, several trees, that were given the legal rights of a person, where you were fined for hurting that person. They're both very interesting articles, but it's one step towards putting the environment at an equal playing field as us. So Aldo Leopold, if you haven't heard of him, is one of the very first environmentalists. He's like 100 years ahead of his time. And yeah, the idea that we should protect the environment, that should be part of all of our policies, that environmental protection should just be written into all of our legal systems, that we should be putting the environment as important as humans And how do we, because currently humans are the most important thing and environment is always, always second. And maybe we should be making laws where if something is going to be harming the environment and humans are only benefiting a little bit, maybe there should be some more give and take there. So the old textbook that I used to use a few years back, I haven't used in a couple of years now, it has a really great chapter where someone pitches the idea of turning environmentalism into a religion and like inspiring and motivating people, and just like religious people will sometimes go to small communities and build churches and build schools, that we should like fund to build environmentalist schools where there aren't very good schooling processes, and help start an environmentalist movement with the children, because if we can educate children, then they grow up to be adults who believe those things that they learned as children. It's a really interesting perspective. I'm going to end this lecture with a sustainable society. There are several different societies living around the world. Some of them are quite large and some of them are quite small. So you could look at some of the Canadian Indigenous cultures as sustainable societies, but many of our sustainable Indigenous societies are quite small. So is these horse nomads. It's a very small society. These guys live in the Eurasian steppes. So that's like kind of like mountain tundra. And they're one of the first people to have domesticated horses. They're often credited as the people who domesticated horses. And they're not super integrated with our society, but they have very isolated communities. A lot of them have cell phones, but they don't have like cell phone coverage. They use them as just like cameras and notebooks and things like that. But they live way up high in the mountains where they train their horses, and then they come down to sell horses in the market. So they live pretty separate most of the time, but then come and integrate with their society to trade. It's a pretty neat community. And it's one that I use as an example. In a typical year, I send you guys out as a bonus assignment to go and find a sustainable society. And after this slide, if you go and check the PDF, I have included several sustainable societies that past students have submitted to me as their bonus assignment. Typically, they submit them to me as a couple of slides, so I haven't edited them. These are the slides that you guys have given me. And maybe you'll research some of them and learn something interesting. And maybe you will go and find your own sustainable society and send me a new slide to add to this slideshow. In the meantime, have a good reading week.